I sat in a windowless room in a building somewhere on the site of a military installation at Groom Lake in the Nevada desert. The only sound was the faint hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional passing of my pen across the page. Seated at a small rectangular desk for nearly an hour, I had been filling out forms for a job I was really looking forward to beginning. When it was to begin and what it was I would be doing was still a matter to be settled. At least I knew for whom I was going to be working, EG&G. Having previously worked at the Los Alamos National Laboratory, I was familiar with EG&G's history. Named after three of its founders, the scientists Harold Edgerton, his one-time graduate student Kenneth Germeshausen, and later Herbert Greer, they had executed high-speed photographic images of implosions tests conducted as part of the Manhattan Project. The company continued as a defense contractor, working with the Atomic Energy Commission on a variety of projects at the Nevada test site to develop weapons. In Las Vegas, most everyone either worked in the resort or gambling industry or as part of what hippies in the 1960s denigrated as the military-industrial complex. In that sense, despite all the glitter and glamour associated with one of its industries, Las Vegas was kind of a company town, all dressed up in either sequins or lab coats or military uniforms. Then there were those who worked in various states of undress. Simply put, I was aware of what went on at Groom Lake in the defense industry and of who some of the major players were. If in January of 1989 I was eager to get back to working in the scientific community after more than 4 years, instead of the fairly lucrative but ultimately not very mentally engaging photo development business I owned and operated out of my house, I was absolutely thrilled to be going to work for one of the biggest players in the defense industry. I was especially keen on working for them because I'd always had an interest in explosive reactions. The bigger, the better. What could be better than working alongside people at the forefront of our defense industry who had a long and successful track record with the biggest of bangs, nuclear weapons? Sign me up, as the expression goes, but the literal signing up was taking a lot more effort than I wanted it to. Some of my excitement was tempered by the fact that I was sitting in that room trying to dredge up the names and addresses of at least 5 individuals who knew me when I was living with my adoptive parents back in Westbury, Long Island, New York in the mid-60s. Having worked at Los Alamos, I was used to the idea of having to provide lists of references for a job, and also a more comprehensive list of past residences, acquaintances, residences, in order to receive the necessary security clearances. For my work at EG&G, in what I was soon to learn was their Special Projects Division, I needed the highest clearance possible, majestic. I was told that level was 22 levels higher than the highest civilian clearance, known as Q clearance. While I understood the need for that level of clearance, it was still a pain in the ass to be sitting there racking my brain trying to recall the names and contact information of people I hadn't seen in years. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat and used the silver push button of a Bic Click pen to trace the wood grain pattern on the table. I smiled ruefully and shook my head. I knew that a retractable pen like the one I held in my hand worked as a result of the interaction between the thrust tube, the thrust device, and the ink chamber and spring. It could produce a reaction sufficient enough to launch the pen off the table's surface by as much as 8 to 11 millimeters. I did not know, however, the contact information for my supervisor at Fairchild Electronics in Chatsworth, California, where I worked while attending classes at Pierce Junior College. I'd spent most of my life interested in taking things apart and putting them back together, such as retractable pens and other devices, and I had made a jet-powered bicycle in my youth and a jet-powered car in my adulthood. But piecing together my employment history and personal life was proving to be a real evil. I looked up at the security guard who stood sentinel to one side of the closed door and wondered if he found this trial by memory as tedious as I did. He was rooted there in what I'd jokingly come to think of over the years as penis protection mode, the manner in which many military men stood when in public. His crossed hands were anchored in front of his groin, his feet spread to just shy of shoulder width. His light blue uniform was military style, but bore no adornments, stripes, insignias, badges, to indicate rank or any other kind of identification. He stood square-jawed and staring straight ahead, as if there was something far beyond the walls of this 12-by-12 room that held his attention. The third member of our trio, Dennis Mariani, was of similar military bearing and appearance. When I shifted my glance to him, he scratched at his close-cropped hair. It was the first he'd moved, other than to blink, shift his eyes, or slide, retrieve, or stack a form, since he'd sat down across from me. Unlike the security guard, Dennis wore a civilian uniform, a navy blue suit, something that could have come out of a man's closet in the 1950s or 1960s. The jacket had narrow lapels and a single chest pocket. Normally, I wouldn't have noticed or commented on such things, but for the last 3 hours, since Dennis had met me at the EG&G offices on the grounds of McCarran Airport and accompanied me on the Janet Air flight out to this remote location, we'd never been separated by more than a few feet. There hadn't been a whole lot else to look at but this sturdily built, heavily lidded man who seemed to be in his mid-30s. In many respects, Dennis reminded me of a boxer. Not the athlete, although, come to think of it, he did have the air of a pugilist about him, but more the canine breed. His expression was seldom slack. He appeared highly attentive, and yet his demeanor revealed nothing of what he was thinking or feeling. I'd met Dennis 2 days earlier at the second of my interviews with the team from EG&G. He sat on the periphery of our group interview, not asking any questions, in his dog-like manner, sitting at the edge of our firelight, observant and seemingly ready to pounce. Whether he was preventing anyone from getting into or out of that circle, I could not determine. He hadn't been present at the first interview, one that I felt had not gone at all well. I'd left, despairing of my chances. A few days lapsed, and I grew more certain that I'd have to enlarge my circle of employment inquiry beyond the driving distance from our home, the one I shared with my second wife Tracy in the West End of Las Vegas. When I was called in for a second interview, I was told that I was considered to be overqualified for the original position for which I'd interviewed. They were impressed with my knowledge and wanted to see how I might fit in as a senior physicist in the Special Projects Division. Obviously, they expected I would accept, and for that reason, I was now searching my memory for the data required to earn me that majestic clearance. I'd always had a bit of the arsonist in me, not so much as a prankster, but as an agitator. I grew tired of dull routines, and particularly the display of self-importance that people who worked at places like Los Alamos, and, I presumed at this point, out at Groom Lake and at EG&G, wore like ID badges. I do serious work. I am a serious person. In the past, I loved to pop that bubble of arrogance with little jokes and witticisms. Mostly I did this to amuse myself rather than take down any of my colleagues. The atmosphere in the room that day was heavy with the elements of that kind of grandiosity, but I knew it was too soon to risk doing anything to relieve the tension. I glanced at my watch. It was now 10:30 at night. I'd hoped that by noting the time, I'd set off some kind of normal human social interaction. Do you have somewhere else to be? What time do you have? Does that watch have a calculator function? What kind of battery life do you get with that? We won't be here much longer. Take your time. We've got all night. All of those floated through my mind as possibilities, but Dennis, and what I decided to now call his marionette, remained statue-like, silent and still. I decided to dip my toe into the water. Time flies, I muttered under my breath. Dennis rose to the bait. "Do you have a question?" His voice sounded familiar, somewhat like the Long Islanders I knew back when, stretching the first two words out as do and you. "No, no question," I said, just thinking out loud. "I just don't have all these names and numbers at my fingertips, you know?" I paused, waiting for him to respond. When he didn't, I added, "I know how important the security clearance is. I want to get this done as quickly as possible. Help make your job easier." "Do what you can. We'll do our job." "I wasn't insinuating—" I stopped when I saw something briefly pass across Dennis's eyes. A sign, maybe, of his irritation with me? I thought again of that second interview I'd just had. How much more, if not jovial, at least collegial, it had all seemed. We were all there for the same reason. All men with technical or scientific backgrounds, and while we weren't cracking jokes, we were at least being human. Dennis had sat there then as unresponsive and blank as he was now. I couldn't tell you the names or the titles of the group of men I'd spoken with that day, but I did recall after the meeting ended that I was most drawn to Dennis and wondered what his story was. Was he always in such a bad mood? As I sat there in that tiny office with him, I felt like my future was hanging in the balance. If this guy ended up hating me, which seemed to be the case, could he make the difference between me being hired full-time and not? As was made clear to me, I was being hired on a provisional basis. Until I received my majestic clearance, I was only going to work on site on an on-call basis. I was pleased to hear that, and even more pleased that they agreed that I could continue to work during the day running the photo developing service out of my home. I needed to pay the bills and all that, I told them. They understood. Still, I'd have to be on call, and when I received notification via phone that I was to go into the office that day, I'd have very little time to get to McCarran to get myself aboard that Janet flight out to the airfield at Groom Lake. Earlier that evening, I'd received the call from a woman identifying herself as Nancy from EG&G. I was to be at McCarran at 7:30 that evening. Having lived in the Las Vegas area for more than 5 years, I was already familiar with the sight of the so-called Janet aircraft taking off and landing from Las Vegas's major airport. McCarran was located only a few miles from the famous Las Vegas Strip. Though Tracy and I lived in West Las Vegas, on the appropriately named James Lovell Street, our business took us all around the metro area, and we both frequently saw the white Boeing 737 jets with the distinctive red markings along the fuselage at window height of the Janet jets. No other emblems were needed, especially since all the locals joked that Janet stood for just another non-existent terminal. That was a reference to the fact that though we daily saw those planes ferrying employees to and from what was often referred to as Area 51, for a long time, the military and the government disavowed the existence of any kind of operation going on around Groom Lake. Many speculated about what went on out there. Given that the Nevada test site was also in the region, and having worked at a government facility with a long history of secrecy, I was pretty sure that Area 51 was a place where experimental aircraft and weapons systems were tested. At the time, there were a few people on the fringe who were into UFOs and speculated about Roswell and the like. I wasn't into the whole extraterrestrial debate and mythos. As a kid, I watched Star Trek, but I was more interested in how its warp drive functioned than I was in about the various life forms they encountered. Some kids might have wanted to be Captain James T. Kirk and engage in extraterrestrial relations, but I wanted to be Scotty and get my hands on dilithium crystals and not the body of a nubile female life form from the planet Zetar. That said, when Tracy and I were house shopping in Las Vegas, we attached no special importance to finding a home on a street named after an astronaut. Jim Lovell was the commander of NASA's Apollo 13 mission. Whoever had developed our little area between Alta Drive to the north and Charleston Boulevard to the south must have had an interest in space exploration. In our little quadrilateral, there was Allen B. Shepard Street, John Glenn Circle, Astronaut Avenue, Michael Collins Place, and Skytrail Place, mixed in among the usual suspects, Oakhurst, Larch, and Hemlock. You could be arboreal or patriotic, or a combination of both. But to be honest, Tracy and I remarked on the name of our street once, and then it just quickly became ingrained as one of the thousands and thousands of unremarkable facts of our lives. So, once I got the call from Nancy to drive to the airport and EG&G for a flight, I was thinking more about whether or not I should have brought a change of clothes or toiletries with me, more than any kind of name coincidences. As a lover of explosive reactions, though, what was second to a nuclear blast in my mind was the thousands and thousands of pounds of thrust produced by those rockets used in the Apollo program. Little did I know how much of a role propulsion was going to play in my life in the months that followed that first call from Nancy. As a scientist, I relied on rationality. I didn't do so to the extent that Mr. Spock might have, but certainly to a great enough degree that though I heard about things like the NJ-12 or Majestic 12 documents, I discounted them as a hoax. Friends and acquaintances knew about the conspiracy theory that existed around that alleged secret organization President Truman founded in 1947 to assist with the recovery and investigation of alien spacecraft. Those discussions were all a part of living in this company town, and the wild imaginings of those on the fringe were exactly that, imaginings, fun to ponder and speculate about, but unlike the influence of organized crime on the development and continued operation of Las Vegas, without real substance to support them. For me, seeing or having some other form of verifiable empirical evidence was believing. The issue of what to believe was on my mind the night of my first trip to Area 51, only because I was going to have to explain to my wife why I was leaving the house so late on a work night. Since Tracy's father had been employed at Los Alamos, and the two of us met there before moving to Las Vegas, she understood why it was that I couldn't tell her much about my new job. I wasn't being evasive or secretive. As I set out from home that night, I truly had no real idea what I would be expected to do that evening or on subsequent evenings. What did strike both of us as odd was that I had to jump immediately into action that night. Who, other than first responders and other emergency personnel, worked under such conditions? "I need to report to EG&G, I said to Tracy. I rushed around the house trying to find my wallet and a lint-free cloth to clean my glasses. Oncoming headlights were bad enough, but when the light refracted off smudged lenses, the blurring and blinding was even worse. I was out the door in less than 20 minutes, minus the change of clothes and toiletries I previously mentioned. My post-rush hour drive to the airport was uneventful, as was the flight out of Vegas. Only a handful of passengers was on the flight with Dennis and me. He had met me at the offices of EG&G and escorted me through a security gate and out onto the tarmac. We exchanged little more than a brief greeting, and I took Dennis's command to follow me to the most literal extent possible. If he wasn't going to speak, then neither was I. I was reminded of the times my father Al took me into New York City or Queens on the Long Island Railroad. Most of the other riders on the train sat singly, or, if forced into being seated next to someone else, regarded him or her as nothing more than a fixture of the train's cabin, something to sometimes bump up against, but not to engage in a conversation with. Even the pilots on the flight were silent. At the point when I felt the plane's speed slacken, Dennis turned to me and said, inclining his head toward the window, "That's the Groom Lake facility below." "Yes, I've heard of it," I told him. "That's where we'll be landing." I didn't respond at all. Dennis's brow raised in surprise. His reaction triggered a similar one in me. His statement seemed obvious, though when we departed McCarran, Dennis made no indication of where we were headed. I didn't tell him that I assumed that Area 51 was our destination. Maybe I'd spoiled the party for him a bit. Maybe he liked to see others get excited at the mention of anything to do with Area 51. The fact that he was even speaking to me seemed like a spell that I shouldn't break with any unnecessary comment. We covered the 100 or so miles quickly, and I imagined our flight path looking something like a steep spike on an oscilloscope. Once we disembarked from the plane, Dennis and I boarded a school bus. It was no longer in its traditional yellow and black livery, but had been painted navy blue. All of the windows, with the exception of the front windshield, had been blacked out. We proceeded along a paved road to the first stop, a nondescript single-story office building. I followed Dennis out of the bus. The late December desert air was cool but refreshing. It was only then that I thought about how tired I was. I'd been unable to sleep and had risen at 6 that morning. Once inside the office complex, Dennis produced a plastic ID badge and held it out to a uniformed guard. The reception area had sets of doors immediately to the left and right of the desk, and one directly behind it. I was led to the left. Dennis switched on the lights, and it took a moment for the fluorescent bulb igniters to heat up the gas. In the dim half-light of the room, I made out a device in Dennis's hands, a camera. "Stand there," Dennis said, pointing to a set of footprints embossed on the floor. He stepped behind a desk, and I stood there for a few moments while he adjusted the equipment, and then the flash stabbed at my eyes. "No, say cheese?" I said, squinting hard to make out Dennis's expression. Didn't matter if I could see his face or not, I immediately thought. It was going to be the same sullen yet alert look. "Follow me." As we passed by the reception desk, the man behind it lifted up a walkie-talkie and produced a manila folder that he handed to Dennis. Neither of them exchanged a single word, let alone anything approximating a pleasantry. I thought that I might like working here, if in fact this was where I would be working. No idle chit-chat, no feigning interest in relative strangers. Sign me up. And that was exactly what Dennis had me doing for nearly the next hour and a half. As I was getting to the last lines of the final document, I could feel my eyelids scratching as I blinked. I tried to remember the last bit of liquid I had taken in. A coffee would have been nice, or even just some water, but I saw no signs of the typical office refreshments anywhere in reception or the 2 rooms I'd been in so far. "I think that should do it," I said at last, sliding the last of the documents across the table to Dennis, careful to turn it so that he received it in the proper orientation. "Follow me," Dennis said after placing the last of the papers into the folder. Outside, Dennis said, "We'll take the bus back to the plane. That will take you back to Las Vegas. There you can pick up your car and go home." "That's it?" "For tonight." I thought it a bit odd that I had to be on the premises to fill out that paperwork. I was considering asking Dennis why they thought it necessary for me to come all the way out there. Before I had a chance to ask, Dennis added, "It's late." I shrugged and thrust my hands in my pockets. I couldn't refute the logic of that statement. I was more than a little amused by Dennis revealing the next steps we'd take, or the steps we'd retrace, and how unnecessary that was. It was also very much in keeping with how people in government jobs often conducted themselves. He stated very clearly the most obvious things, but left unstated what I most wanted to know. When was I going to come back here? What exactly would I be working on? Who would be my boss? My string of questions was interrupted by the squeak of the bus brakes. I bit my tongue when Dennis said the last words to me that he'd offer that night. "The bus is here." An hour and a half later, I slid beneath the sheets of our bed, hoping not to wake Tracy, but she snapped on the light on the nightstand. "How was it?" she asked, then tried to stifle a yawn. "I couldn't agree more," I said. She looked puzzled, and I realized that my reference to her yawn wasn't clear. "Hard to tell from a first day. A lot of paperwork. Boring stuff, really. I'm sure it will get better. It has to, I said. I lay awake for a few moments thinking about the next day. I was going to have to drive out to a realtor on the north end of the city to pick up a few rolls of film. I couldn't remember if I'd filled the tank with gas. Just as I was about to drift into sleep, Tracy said to me, "While you're out tomorrow, can you pick up a can of coffee and a pint of half and half?" Chapter 1. The following morning, after a quick cup of coffee, I headed out to pick up the photos from a regular client, a real estate appraiser, who worked out of an office near the Painted Desert golf course. The course had just opened, and along with it a housing development had gone up, and many others as well, in that area far north of the Strip. Many of my clients worked in real estate. New construction was booming. Current residents were taking advantage of rising prices to move up to new homes. The population rose from just shy of 275,000 people in 1970 to nearly 465,000 by 1980, and was destined to reach 740,000 by the start of the 90s. Simply put, business was good for anyone in real estate and housing, and I liked working with clients who were professionals rather than someone who came in griping that their vacation shots were overexposed. Still, as I drove along with my window down, the scent of change was in the air as much as the exhaust fumes from the many diesel engines powering ready-mix cement trucks and semi-tractor trailers loaded with lumber. I wasn't certain when I'd be called back to EG&G, and in some ways that was okay with me, at least temporarily. I figured it was just a matter of time before my security clearance came through. I knew that traffic along I-15 was going to be tight, so I chose Nevada 95 instead, and I felt a little sorry for those commuters sealed in their cars listening to one morning zoo crew or another on their radios. The news was still full of stories about the horrific terrorist bombing of a Pan Am flight over Lockerbie, Scotland. I switched off the radio, preferring the company of my thoughts to how horrifying it must have been in those few instants before the blast obliterated part of the craft and the intact pieces hurtled to the ground. Maybe because we were nearing the end of one year and the beginning of another, but I was in a more contemplative mood than usual. My first day at EG&G didn't exactly begin with a blaze of glory, but at least I had made some headway in my desire to return to more meaningful work. I enjoyed the photo business that my first wife Carol and I had begun several years earlier when we were still living in Los Alamos, but it was hardly what I would call intellectually stimulating. For a while, that was fine with me. I had needed to clear my head. I adored Carol, and the two of us had built a wonderful partnership together. As husband and wife, we shared a vision for what our lives should be like. In many ways, we were living the American dream. I'd grown tired of working for someone else and had left my job working for Los Alamos National Laboratory, LANL, and set up Lazar Energy Systems, designing, developing, and repairing alpha radiation detection systems. LANL used a lot of plutonium, which gives off alpha radiation, and for 4 years straight, Lazar Energy Systems was granted a government contract to provide that form of radiation detection. As many had discovered before me, it was far better to work with a government agency than it was to work for one. It was certainly more lucrative, and I also got to be my own boss. The photo business was Carol's to oversee, and that brought in more than a fair amount of revenue. We were doing well financially. We'd even invested in a legalized brothel in Las Vegas that was taking in $100,000 a month at the time we purchased it for $1 million. The Honeysuckle Ranch had been in business for more than 30 years, had a solid management team in place, and with Carol doing careful oversight of the operation, we expected the wheels to keep on turning and the money to keep rolling in. Add to that the photo operation, and the two of us were incredibly busy, mostly working from home, socking away as much as we could. I did give in to one indulgence, the purchase of a 1984 Chevrolet Corvette, but we lived a quiet and unassuming life. That is, with the exception of the jet car I'd built and tooled around town in. That eventually got me some attention and figured prominently in my getting a job at EG&G. I was too busy living my life to really reflect much on it and our reasons for doing the things we were doing. The general tenor of the 80s decade was examined in an Oliver Stone movie, Wall Street, that featured Michael Douglas as the financier Gordon Gekko. His lizard-like name was no accident, and what most people who saw the film will likely remember is a line from a speech Gekko delivered. Greed is good. I can't say that Carol and I were greedy, but we were definitely driven to succeed. Success for us, and for most people, meant making money. If it took running 3 separate businesses, not taking vacations, and having work-related issues on your mind 24 hours a day and 7 days a week, then that was a price we were willing to pay. A price I wasn't willing to pay, and for a few months wasn't even aware I was paying, was the loss of Carol's life. For a time, she was able to hide her pancreatic cancer diagnosis from me. Toward the end, her frequent absences from home, her weight loss, the sallowness of her complexion, and the anguished look of pain on her face when she thought I couldn't see her aroused my suspicion. Before I could get her to stop saying that it was nothing, that she was just feeling a little run down, she waited for me to leave the house to run a few errands. She sat behind the wheel of her car in the closed garage and ended her life. I can't describe the feelings of devastation and loss that followed. I missed her and struggled with the kinds of questions that a man in his late 30s ought not to have taken on: mortality and the larger issues of why we're here. What do all our hard work and dreams mean when one day you can come home and discover that the woman you adore felt she had to face alone such an awful set of choices? To say that I was reeling is an understatement. I was overwhelmed by guilt and anger and sorrow. Responsibilities weighed heavily on me, and as much as I wanted to keep our businesses afloat as a way to honor what Carol and I had built, the feeling that none of it mattered eventually won out. Whatever minor dissatisfactions I had felt about Los Alamos, the intellectual snobbery that many who worked at the LANL exhibited and lorded over the rest of the residents, paled in comparison to how much I associated that place with the loss of my wife. I wanted to get out of there, and eventually did. One saving grace in all of this, which I felt Carol had a hand in making, was that Tracy was in my life. Carol had hired her to work at one of our photo stores. She was a bit of a wild child, to be sure, but the two of us grew close, drawn together by the belief that Carol had set in motion the events that led to Tracy and me getting married soon after Carol's death. Tracy and I had traveled to Las Vegas together to oversee some matter related to the photo business. What that matter was is lost in a fog now. I don't know if either of us noted the irony of it, but we were married at the We've Only Just Begun chapel in Las Vegas in April of 1986. When I arrived at the pickup point, I got out of the car and walked to the door. Taped to it was a 9x12 mailer. Inside were a couple of rolls of Kodak Ektachrome film and a brief note of apology for not being there to meet me in person. I tucked the envelope under my arm, and while walking back to the car, realized that I hadn't eaten a thing since lunch the previous day. I found a little mom-and-pop diner nearby and pulled in. The film would get developed and printed in plenty of time. Tracy would get her coffee and half. I settled into a booth, grateful that I could set my own schedule, and wondered how I might adjust to having to report and work under someone else's timeline. In science, one of the ways that the word entropy is used is to talk about how any natural system tends to move from order to disorder. In many ways, that is a perfect description of that period of my life. Tracy helped keep things from falling apart completely, and there was something in my nature that also wouldn't allow me to just simply shrug my shoulders in resignation. It took me a few years of running the photo business in Las Vegas to regain my footing. I realized that when in doubt, you should go back to the things you love. And for me, that was science. It's funny to think of it now, but as I struggled that night in that office filling out paperwork and coming up with names and dates, the one that shouldn't have escaped me, and in fact didn't, was Alan Rothberg. Alan and I lived on the same block in Westbury and went to Bowling Green Elementary School together. His father was an instructor at Nassau Community College, where he taught chemistry. He'd bring home various equipment, high-voltage demonstrator tubes, Geissler tubes, and other things. Some kids might have had children's chemistry sets to play with, but with access to Alan's father's classroom and supplies, we were conducting actual experiments with the kind of equipment you'd find in a research center's laboratory. My family moved around a bit at that time, back to Brooklyn, out to California, then back to Westbury due to my dad's work. Alan was the one constant for me in that neighborhood, and I took great delight in attending the classes his father taught during the summer session. I was in junior high by that time, and Alan and I both loved the idea that we would take the same test as the real students and could consistently outscore them. In high school, I was an indifferent student in most of my other classes, but science was a big part of my academic life and success. Outside of school, I devoured issues of popular science, popular mechanics, and science and mechanics, as other kids my age lost themselves in the Marvel universe of Spider-Man, Captain America, and other comic book heroes and villains. I still have many back issues of those science magazines in my possession today. What really enticed me about the magazines I read was that they weren't about pure theoretical science. They provided me with plans that I could use to make things. The schematics for building a Wimshurst machine, an electrostatic generator, appeared in one issue. I was ready for the challenge and built one, essentially using two discs with metal sections attached to them to spin in opposite directions, producing high voltage through electrostatic induction. Instead of relying on friction, they produced the charges through influence. I also built a Tesla coil. I was stymied for a while on that project because I needed an automobile engine's ignition coil. Believe me, I was sorely tempted to raid my father's Oldsmobile, but I resisted. Just prior to this, I had installed in my room a box with a red light and a green light that I could switch between, indicating to my parents and my sister, like me, she was also adopted, when I'd allow them into my room. I did this because my mom had gone into my inner sanctum while I was away to do some cleaning. She stepped into the room, got tangled in some electrical wires, setting off a shower of sparks and tripping a few breakers. I didn't need to add to their worries about what their mad scientist had done by creating car trouble for them. Fortunately for me, we were living in Brooklyn at the time, and more than a few abandoned cars littered the neighborhood. While out riding my bike, I managed to scavenge an ignition coil from the dented, rusted, and windowless remains of an American Motors Pacer that other car carrion-eaters had stripped. When the Tesla coil was done, I could sit for hours watching it spew its colorful corona discharge, brush discharges, and streamer arcs. Almost as much as I got a rush of accomplishment when I built something from one of those magazines, I was also excited every time I looked at the Estes catalog. Estes Industries was based in Denver, Colorado, and they were producers of the finest functional scale model rockets at the time. Alan and I and a few other guys in Westbury were really into building them and launching them while in junior high and high school. The construction of the rocket wasn't that complex. In fact, quite the opposite. The engines were supplied either in the kit or could be purchased separately. There wasn't enough do-it-yourself activity to keep me interested in their flight. The engines were housed within a sturdy cardboard tube. Inside the tube were a ceramic nozzle, solid propellant, delay charge, ejection charge, and a clay retainer cap. We'd run a coated wire through the nozzle and make contact with the solid propellant. We then attached that wire to a battery and the electric current would heat the wire and ignite the solid propellant. An engine could also be ignited by the hot gases from the propellant of a booster engine. I wanted to take on the challenge of building my own rocket engines from scratch. Small diameter cardboard tubing that would withstand the explosive forces wasn't difficult to source. Many wire coat hangers had cardboard wrapped around the bottom of the triangle. It was the solid fuel that we needed to make. Cook is probably a better term, and I set about researching. I read a number of articles that made reference to something called meal powder. At that point, I didn't understand what meal powder was, a finely grained gunpowder. To me, a meal was a meal, and the only meal I had access to was oatmeal. Oatmeal might be able to fuel muscles, but it didn't do a thing for those early rocket engines I tried to create. It wasn't that I didn't have the money for replacement engines. In my early teens, I'd gotten a job at a local fireworks manufacturer. Talk about a kid in a candy store. But I didn't get involved in the manufacturing process at all. Mostly I just helped out by packaging the various items they produced. I didn't earn a whole lot, but enough. I also learned enough to solve the rocket propellant problem. That information, plus greater exposure to Alan's dad's chemistry classes and a few of his chemistry supplies, had me launching rockets thousands of feet into the air at Salisbury Park. I knew enough from chemistry to know that combining potassium nitrate, KNO3, and sugar and heating them together would produce what those in the model rocket know called rocket candy because of the distinctive smell of the sugar caramelizing as it was heated and absorbed the KNO3. Funny to think how much of my early rocket propulsion days were associated with food. Oatmeal, Salisbury steak, rocket candy. KNO3 was the sole component of stump remover, a chemical application homeowners or contractors could use to dissolve tree stumps. I also became our chief project engineer in the manufacture of pyrotechnic and other explosive devices. That was mostly due to the fact that my friends didn't seem as interested in blowing things up as I was. They were good with the rockets and enjoyed the pyrotechnic displays, but I was interested in seeing how chemicals could react with one another to produce small-scale explosions. That experimentation was a natural offshoot of my rocket engine making. Working with various compounds like the KNO3 plus sugar formula, I was eventually able to produce my version of an M80 firecracker and other smaller firecrackers that produced a loud bang and little more. I tried to mass-produce them for the 4th of July, along with cherry bombs, and managed to make quite a few, but as impressed as friends were with my efforts, their interest waned. The laws of supply and demand exerted themselves, but that only tempered my business interests and not my passion for the products and their explosive displays. I don't know how much of the other guy's loss of interest was attributable to the one incident that resulted from faulty handling of the products. I'd taken potassium chlorate and red phosphorus and carefully wrapped them together in a tissue. This combination is often referred to in the pyrotechnic community as death mix. The reason for that is because the chemicals are friction sensitive and thus very unstable. I'd take that mixture I'd placed into a tissue and then folded it around the shaft of a bolt, sandwiched between two nuts. I'd thread a nut onto the bolt to secure the little explosive package. After you tossed that bolt grenade and it hit the ground, it would erupt in a huge puff of smoke and a loud bang. Once at Alan's house, he was standing on the sidewalk that led to their front door. He tried to toss the bolt underhanded toward the street, but it slipped out of his hand, went a few feet back toward the house, and detonated near the porch. We spent a good hour cleaning up the front door and porch area in a complete panic as the hour neared for his parents to return home. Fortunately, all the smoke stains came off, and no one was the wiser, except us. We kept a safer distance from Alan's house from that point forward. Looking back on it now, if that was the worst thing that happened, we were all pretty fortunate. I can't believe some of the stuff I was doing and how it might have all gone wrong if I wasn't as fortunate as I'd been. As I sat in the booth of the diner, finishing my pancakes, I thought about those days from my youth because of the nature of the questions I was asked during my second interview at EG&G. I thought it a little odd that they kept asking me about my hobbies and other interests outside of work. I believed they might want to know more about my training, what I did at Los Alamos, that kind of thing. After all, as I was to find out toward the end of the interview, they were considering me for a senior staff physicist position. The reality was that my interests outside of work hadn't changed very much since I was a kid. I was still involved in pyrotechnics. I hosted the Desert Blast for a number of years, setting off a terrific display of fireworks each summer. I'd also created a jet car, installing one in a Honda Civic I owned, and later put a larger jet engine in a rail dragster. I took my jet cars to drag strips all around the Southwest and beyond. In a very real sense, if it wasn't for my interest in rocketry, pyrotechnics, and my love of science and powerful reactions, I might not ever have had an opportunity to interview with EG&G. Before all that, however, I had to get some additional technical experience. In 1976, my parents had moved to California again. I was determined to take a year off from college, but instead enrolled at Pierce Junior College on a part-time basis. I also got a job working for a company called Fairchild Electronics. They manufactured equipment to test something called bubble memory devices. Think of them as an early precursor of the hard drives that we have in today's personal computers. Instead of a semiconductor, the main memory component of these devices was a slice of crystal. The people at Fairchild were absolutely certain that bubble memory was going to be the key to the future of computing excellence. Obviously, they were wrong, but at that time, bubble memory was a viable means to store data produced by mainframe computers. The other option was reel-to-reel tapes, the kind you'd see in movies and television encased in large metal cabinets. Just so you don't think that bubble memory devices were too out there, I can also recall a system of programmable memory that used ultraviolet light in order to erase the data on them. Given how sophisticated our devices are now, this seems impractical at best and boneheaded at worst. But those were the times. I originally worked at Fairchild as a technician repairing broken circuit boards, but eventually became a test engineer, and later an engineer designing circuit and logic boards. I loved electronics, and I was earning money and going to school at Caltech by this time. I was studying electronics there mainly because the people at Fairchild thought that was the best use of my time. But in my off hours from school and Fairchild, I was working on my own projects at home. Lasers had captured my interest, and I was working with plasma containment and MHD, magnetohydrodynamics. But I knew that I had to pay my dues, and if working with electronics was a way in, then that's what I was willing to do. But my desire was still to become a scientist and leverage my love of physics into a place in the defense industry working on weapons systems. At that period in our history, weapons systems meant nuclear weapons. We were still waging the Cold War. Ronald Reagan was in office, and his proposed Star Wars nuclear missile defense system was still making headlines. By the summer of 1982, my feet had grown itchy, and my desire to take the next step was too great to keep me at Fairchild. As much as the move to California from New York had initially been a bit of culture shock, I'd grown to really like the stereotypical but true laid-back surfer dude mentality of the people I worked with. They had treated me well, and there I was at the age of 23, working as an electronics engineer, even though I was still a few credits shy of actually having a college degree. I wanted more, so in the summer of 1982, I sent a cover letter and resume to Los Alamos National Laboratory. I spent an anxious few weeks waiting to hear back from them. I'd almost given up hope, but I received a call one day in September inviting me down for an interview. I accepted, and as part of the interview process, I was taken on a tour of the facility. I knew a lot about its history and the Manhattan Project, But the Mason physics facility was all relatively new to me. I knew that the particle accelerator was there, but when you read about a device being a half-mile in length, it's hard to truly get the scale of the thing until you're on site. I was in awe. Seeing a Van de Graaff generator the size of small office complexes took my breath away. The fact that these machines were producing millions of volts was absolutely astounding. I was in power heaven. I saw bicycles propped up along various stretches of the runway, for lack of a better term, that ran alongside the accelerator and its associated buildings. The device was so large that technicians and scientists would pedal from one location inside the building to the next in order to save time. How cool was that? I will never forget looking at one meter, and the lowest number on its measurement range was 110 kilovolts. And these guys were accelerating particles to such a speed that time itself was being affected. I felt like I had stepped into the world of science fiction. I was moving among men and women with an intellectual capacity that was nearly as great as the power these machines were generating. I wanted to work there, even if it meant that I was going to be working in the electronic monitoring side of things and not conducting experiments. They also expressed a lot of interest in my work with lasers, and during the interview, and even after I was hired, there was some talk of possibly utilizing that experience at the facility. The odd thing was, as was the case with EG&G, they wanted to know as much about my interests and activities outside of work as they did my work experience or education. Also, it's hard to imagine from the perspective of this post-9/11 world we inhabit that the level of security on the facility would seem completely lax today. I was free to roam around the facility on the day of my interview, as well as after I was hired. I was reminded of those days with my dad that we spent at the Hall of Science in Flushing Meadows, Queens, and Corona Park, the site of the World's Fair in 1964. He'd take me to that museum, and I could wander among the displays, knowing that I was walking along and seeing some of the great moments in human history, intellectual history, represented before my very eyes. I'm not a big sports fan, but having lived in New York, I know how revered the Yankees are. In many ways, those trips to the Hall of Science and those first hours and later months and years were like setting loose a Yankee fan on the field at Yankee Stadium. Not only was I allowed on the field, I got to play there. Obviously then, when they made an offer that day for me to work there, I accepted. I returned to California, gave my notice, packed my belongings, and within a month was in Los Alamos and working at Mason. I was in for a bit of culture shock there as well. The employees there, as I said, possessed some of the most powerful scientific minds in the world. I was used to working with lasers, but these were human beings with a similar kind of intensity and focus. They weren't exactly like Dennis Mariani. The air of menace he gave off wasn't a part of these people's temperament, but they were similarly serious-minded and watchful. Over time, I'd learned that the locals referred to the staff at Los Alamos as the Coneheads, the alien family from Beldar who were brought to life on the TV show Saturday Night Live. Ironically, in Los Alamos, particularly among the staff at Los Alamos, it was generally Saturday Night Dead. Make that every night dead, really. By 6 p.m., most people at the facility had their workday over. That part of town was so quiet that the traffic signals all flashed red lights, letting drivers roll to a stop and then proceed one at a time. My newbie excitement wore off, not just because the place was boring, but because of the kind of arrogance I've mentioned before. Sure, in school I had to endure my fair share of taunting and teasing because of my interest in science and my disinterest in sports. I've never thought myself superior to anyone or that I was in any way inferior. I just had different interests. That wasn't the case with a lot of people I worked with. and the derision they felt for the rest of Los Alamos, the city, and people in general was more than a little off-putting. I also didn't like working for the federal government. I hated to see the kind of waste of funds and supplies that working with other people's money produced. In fact, it was our money, since we paid taxes like everyone else. But for as smart as these people were, they didn't always seem to understand that, or at least they didn't seem to care. All of that culminated in me becoming a bit of a prankster, but I liked to think of myself as a prankster with a cause. As its name implies, a particle accelerator gets particles to move at a rapid rate, to the speed of light. Most of what were referred to as the targets, the particles accelerated, had to be cooled to close to absolute zero. That way, the atoms and molecules inside them would be essentially inert, not moving. To do that cooling, you need vast amounts of a specific isotope of helium, helium-3. It is a rare and expensive isotope, and we had it brought in by the truckload in specially equipped tanker trucks, which were essentially like scale vacuum thermoses designed to keep the incredibly cold gas as chilled as possible. Even in a vacuum-sealed environment, helium-3 is boiling off due to the tank's exposure to the ambient temperature. Generally, as soon as those trucks rolled onto the property and to where they were needed, the gas was offloaded. Except on days when no experiments were being conducted. The trucks still rolled in, but they sat there, as the enormously expensive payload they were carrying dissipated into the atmosphere. The trucks would be parked on these radiation shield blocks with 6-inch diameter hoses spewing off helium gas. I wasn't an accountant. I wasn't in the procurement department. But that kind of waste really irked me. I mentioned it to a few colleagues, and they would shrug and say, "Hey, it's government work. They've got deep pockets, so why worry about it?" So I didn't, except in my own little way. One day, when the accelerator wasn't in operation and I didn't have to monitor any of the sensors, I was a little bored. I saw the trucks outside. I saw a few rolls of the tape we used to cordon off areas or to label any items that might have been exposed to even trace levels of radiation. It was kind of like crime scene tape, except it was magenta and yellow and said, "Danger, radiation," all along it. I went to a custodian and asked for a few plastic trash bags, the kind that lined the large bins in the cafeteria and not the small office waste paper baskets. He gave me a box. I went outside and placed a bag over the pipe from which the now no longer supercooled helium was being discharged. I tied off the bag with the danger radiation tape. I held on to it, and I could feel it tugging at my arm, begging to be released. I let it go and watched it climb. That was fun. The second was fun as well. I didn't want to keep all the enjoyment to myself, so I went inside and got my friend and colleague Joe to join me. We spent our lunch break filling and releasing helium balloons. Eventually, we stood there at the end of our lunch hour watching this dotted line of trash bags being carried south of our location on the prevailing winds. The facility sat on a high point and was separated from the main area of the town by a somewhat shallow valley. We could see the path they were taking, and, familiar with the area, we knew generally where they were heading.